Hi, welcome to the podcast. This is Who Killed Theresa, and I'm your host, John Allure. And today we have a guest interview. Dr. Kim Rossmo is going to be joining us. Kim Rossmo is a Canadian criminologist specializing in geographic profiling. He joined the Vancouver Police Department as a civilian employee in 1978 and became a sworn officer in 1980. In 1987, he received a master's degree in criminology from Simon Fraser University, and in 1995 became the first police officer in Canada to obtain a doctorate in criminology. His dissertation research resulted in a new criminal investigative methodology called geographic profiling. In 1995, he was promoted to detective inspector and founded a geographic profiling section within the Vancouver Police Department. In 1998, his analysis of cases of missing sex trade workers determined that a serial killer was at work, a conclusion ultimately vindicated by the arrest and conviction of serial killer Robert Pickton in 2002. Upon leaving the Vancouver Police Department, he served as Director of Research at the Police Foundation in Washington, D.C., and then he moved to Texas State University, where he currently holds the endowed chair in criminology and is director of the Center for Geospatial Intelligence and Investigation. And I'm going to say, Kim Rossmo, welcome.
Good afternoon. How are you today, John?
I'm awfully good. It's a little strange to. I think I've only spoken to you once before. We mostly have communicated through email and social media. And we've never met, I think, in 16 years, unless I'm forgetting something.
No, we haven't.
Yeah. So I wanted to get right to it and ask you a real direct question. In layman's terms, for somebody, well, actually, before I ask that question, I want to pose something else to you. And it's this, about geographic profiling. If I go to the internet and look up geographic profiling, which is to say Wikipedia, although the source is backed by some documentation, it says the formalized process known today as geographic profiling originated out of research conducted at Simon Fraser University's School of Criminology in British Columbia, Canada in 1989. Is that essentially you they're talking about there? Or is it you and many others? Could you kind of unpack that maybe a little bit for us?
Well, it was my research. It was actually the research I did for my doctoral dissertation. But I think it's important to realize that whenever you do something, you're building from the work that others have done. So in my case, there were several people whose, shoulders, quote unquote, I stood on. Key were Paul and Patricia Brantingham, professors in the School of Criminology at Simon Fraser University, who had developed the theoretical models that were important to me.
And in layman's terms, what is geographic profiling? I mean, I'm sure you've come up with some kind of elevator speech about what it is over the years.
Well, there's a lot of hype and mystery that surrounds profiling generally. The better known psychological profiling or behavioral profiling can be defined as making inferences about the offender's characteristics from the characteristics of the crime itself. And in that way, geographic profiling is similar. We take a look at the locations of the crimes. And by the crimes, I'm talking about a connected series of crimes, like with the locations of murders in a serial murder case, or of rapes in a serial rape case, or robberies. So we believe the crimes are all committed by the same person. We look at the locations of the crimes and their surrounding geography, and then we try to make inferences about where the offender most likely lives or what his activity space is like. So we're treating geography as a clue, and then we're using that to help us focus on where the offender might be. Its primary function is not to solve a crime. Profiling cannot do that. All you can do to solve a crime is get a confession, a witness, or physical evidence. But what you can do with a profile is to manage information. And to help you prioritize suspects. It is not unusual in these cases to have hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands of suspects. So trying to find who you're looking for is like trying to locate a needle in a haystack.
Right, and then further from that, so that's kind of that's the science overlay of what geographic profiling is. Explain to some listeners what the software you developed, Rigel, is. How that tool is then used to create these. I guess they're called surface maps, 3-dimensional maps to help you hone in on an offender.
Okay, Rigel is based on the algorithm that was developed for my doctoral research. A company in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, called ECRI, Environmental Criminology Research Incorporated, took my ideas and they turned them into a functional piece of software that is used by a number of police and military agencies around the world. And what you do is you just open up a case, you take a look at a map of the area that you're working in, and then you put in the addresses of the crimes, or maybe the latitude and longitude, and then you create what's called a scenario from those crimes. And the last thing you do is you press a button and it creates this geoprofile, which is actually a 3-dimensional probability surface. We call it a jeopardy surface. And it uses colors to show you where the area most likely, where the area where the offender most likely is based. So they'll dark red for the most probable areas, and then you go through like greens and yellows, with grays being the least probable. The idea is then you can look at the area of the crimes, or you can overlay suspects. Let's say you have 100 suspects, and you can prioritize them by where they sit on that profile. One of the advantages of geographic profiling is that addresses are such a common part of so many databases. So, for example, criminal records, a jail booking sheet, a traffic ticket, credit card files, electoral voting list. I mean, there's just everything has an address attached to it, it seems. In fact, it's been estimated that 85% of records contain some sort of address. And that's a handle that we can grab and use to manipulate the data, prioritize the suspects, and then police can proceed and try to solve the crime using the methods we talked about before, looking for witnesses, trying to obtain confessions, or most commonly physical evidence.
So that kind of touches on something I wanted to bring up. I believe that when your foundational work started in the late 1980s, we hadn't entered a world of GIS, GPS, these apps that track all kinds of data, and without getting too Snowden-y or politically about it. How has that change in landscape affected geographic profiling and the Rigel system?
Well, the development of software, computing power, smartphones has just been tremendous. So when I began, GIS systems, geographic information systems, were incredibly expensive, and I actually had to work literally with X and Y coordinates and graph paper, and it just was very cumbersome to do a case. If I wanted to do a profile analysis, I actually put in the original software some musical tones that would play, because it might take half an hour to do an analysis. Now, between Google Maps, Google Earth, low-cost mapping software, what I can get on my iPhone or my iPad, this is all trivial. Computing power is such that it will literally take seconds. And this is all with a software system that has evolved from about 500 lines of code to a couple of million lines of code. So we just do things so much more powerfully, quicker, faster. And I was just working on a case the other day involving a serial rapist, and I could easily just pull up on my phone satellite imagery of where I was and for certain, features that were relevant to the analysis. It's just really amazing.
Yeah. Moving a little more personal now, and I'd like to kind of go back and trace your steps from police officer to criminologist. But before that, I noticed, well, that you had written the obituary in the Globe and Mail last fall for your father, who passed at the age of 90. And I was really struck by that, what you wrote, Kim, because it was such a celebration of his life. There was so much life in that content. Typically obits are, these were the pallbearers, this is the family, this is the charity where, donations can be made. Yours was nothing like that. Could you talk about where you grew up and your father's influence on you?
I was born in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. At an early age, our family moved to Burnaby, next to Vancouver, for a couple of years, and so actually most of my earliest memories were from there. Then we moved back. My dad had been in the Royal Canadian Navy in the Second World War, and then had come back and worked with the Canadian Pacific Railway. He eventually left and engaged in some small businesses. He was a bit of an inventor and had a number of patents in Canada and the United States. So I think what I inherited from my father were a number of things, including a bit of a sense of adventure, some maybe interest in inventing and developing things. But I think most important were sort of the moral and the ethical aspects of doing the right thing that our parents tried to teach all of us. And they're also very much, you have to, they'll support you, but you are also responsible for your actions, and they never tried to tell us what to do, but they did make it clear that education was going to be very important part of our lives. So I think, my family was never very wealthy, but I think the fact that they gave us the tools for approaching life and for, living the way we should, I think that was incredibly valuable, and we were fortunate to obtain that from them.
And did you pursue a career in law enforcement as a means to an end? Did you know you were eventually going to climb that education ladder through aspects of law enforcement?
Well, I probably reached that point through a number of U-turns. So I was originally in high school very interested in the sciences. I was quite good at mathematics, and that was my career path. But my first couple of years at university were not very successful. I had lost my interest. I didn't really want to do this as a job. I wanted something with more excitement, and I ended up taking a year off university. I started working for a private investigation company. I got interested in the whole, exciting aspects and thought about policing. My original plan, though, was to maybe work for a police agency for 5 years to get some experience, to make some money, and then pursue a master's degree in criminology. I then go on and do something with that. But there are a few realities that hadn't sunk in. One was, it is very hard to join a police department. I think Vancouver took something like 1 out of 50 applicants, and there was I had to learn how to swim. I didn't know how to swim, so there was another hurdle. And by the time I actually got hired, I put a lot of time and effort into it, and the idea of leaving after 5 years didn't really make much sense. Plus, I found that I really, really liked the job. It was a lot of fun. It was interesting, challenging. You're hopefully doing something for the public good. And then I tried something, which was to pursue my master's while I was still working. And I found that was possible. You had to give up a lot of things, including sleep, but it was something that worked for me. And when I finished my master's, I took a couple years off to recover, and then went back and did my doctorate while I was working.
So and correct me if I'm wrong, I think you were a Vancouver police officer for 20 years. Did I read that right?
21 years.
Okay. And so during this time, you're often described very romantically as a beat cop. What is a beat cop? What were you doing? What was some of your? I know you were on patrol in Vancouver's downtown east side, but what was your kind of daily life in those 20 years like as an officer?
Well, I did two stints in what at that time we referred to as Vancouver's Skid Road area, and I walked a beat there, which I found to be very interesting because you're out of your car, you're up close with individuals. I think you learn more about the community. You also learn more about criminals and criminal behavior because it was such a concentrated area. The importance of location, of the geography of the places, became very clear to me. So I really liked that form of policing, and I think that while it's not for everybody, some people really like the connections that you make and your opportunity to work in a high crime rate area. But I did other things too, patrol in other areas. I worked the Expo Squad when we had Expo 86 in 1986 when Vancouver hosted the World's Fair. I did a time in organized crime intelligence, crime prevention, and then for the last 5 years of my career, I worked as detective inspector in charge of the Vancouver Police Department's geographic profiling section, which was set up really to do geographic profiling for our agency and for other police departments around the world as a result of me getting my PhD. So that gave me, another very unique perspective on crime and criminal investigations.
And was that unit the first of its kind?
Yes, it was the first one in the world.
Right.
And so since then, others have been set up with, in example, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the British National Crime Faculty.
And so we may as well confront it. The Robert Pickton serial murders, 3 decades of violence, beginning the earliest case we know, 1971 with Serena Abbotsway, finally ending.
No, I think the evidence says that he appeared to start probably 94. That's the very earliest in physical evidence. But we still had someone doing 6 or 7 years worth of damage, and upwards of maybe 49 murders.
Right. Sometimes called Canada's worst serial killer, depending on how you look at the evidence. At what point did your work, your research work, and your work on patrol in the East Side begin to intersect?
Well, because I worked in that area, I had a familiarity with the area, what went on there. But I got involved as a result of my geographic profiling experience in my research, which involved a lot of analysis, both research-wise academically, but also operationally with serial killers. And at the time, we really didn't know what the situation was either. We just had disappearances. We had some women that went missing. But it became clear that this was very suspicious. One of the things I did was obtain data on how many unfound missing people we had from that area going back 20 years. And when you look at those numbers, we're seeing 0, 1, or 2. Because most missing people end up being located. So now we've got like 5, 10. Since 95, the numbers had really started to increase dramatically. And that increase was significant statistically. Now, we had arguments maybe we just needed more time to find these missing women. But that wasn't torn out by the data either, because most people are found within a couple of days. So we had something that had occurred. It was meaningful. It was an aberration from the past. It wasn't occurring in other Canadian cities. And we had to look at an explanation. And the explanation also had to come for the fact that we weren't finding bodies, and it was only happening to women. One of the theories thrown out there, for example, like hospitals were not keeping good records, or this was part of the drug trade, didn't make any sense, because if it was true, we would expect to see males as well as females, but it was only women that were going missing.
Right.
And then some of the investigators on the case determined that these women had stopped collecting their welfare checks. And if you worked in that part of Vancouver, you would realize that most people are on welfare. One of the most important things they would do if they did move to another location was to register a new address with the Ministry of Social Services so they could continue to collect their welfare checks. But that hadn't happened. Now, maybe one person, two people might do that, but not the numbers that we had at that time, which were in the 20s, almost 30. So that really suggests that we most likely had a serial killer.
With that piece of that fact alone, it must have been a huge bellwether. What do you think accounts for police resistance in confronting what was actually happening?
Well, no agency wants to have a serial killer. I mean, it's a huge demand on resources. There are hard cases to solve. I think in our case, we had a manager in the major crime section that had made up his mind already and wasn't going to be swayed by the facts. There were issues regarding the level of resources available. The police department's going through some budget cuts. Another complication was Picton was known to be a suspect quite early, but Picton lives in Port Coquitlam, which is an RCMP jurisdiction. So you had women going missing from Vancouver and the prime suspect in a completely different police jurisdiction. That caused some problems.
So so what you're describing here is cross-jurisdictional confusion. Is something similar in the cases that I was dealing with in Quebec. Certainly something not unfamiliar with the situation with the London police and the OPP with the series of murders that happened in London, Ontario through the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Well, when you get more than one agency involved, then it's not always clear who's in charge, who's responsible, and if you have overlapping responsibilities, it usually means no one's responsible.
Do you think, in your opinion, offenders deliberately exploit this in some cases?
I think, well, there's evidence that some are familiar with this and that it's a weakness in investigations, and I think some just are lucky. In this case, Picton lived one place. He wasn't going to find the type of victims that he was interested in, out in the suburbs. He had to come into downtown Vancouver. He would take the remains of some of his slaughtered pigs to a rendering plant right on the harbor, which is very close to where these women worked. So, I don't know if he consciously manipulated this system this way, or it was just a function of
his habits,
where he lived, type of victims, and where he traveled.
Right. For me, geographic profiling is, for me, it just explains human behavior, and you've sort of gone into that sometimes in your work. I know the idea that offenders in most cases are not criminal masterminds. They're following something that you've described as the least effort principle. It's just they're you look at the geography to explain their sort of habitual daily habits.
Yes, a lot of this is just common sense.
Right. So, moving up, you leave Vancouver. You're at the Police Foundation in Washington D.C., and it's right around this time in the early 2000s that I sort of indirectly met up with you, and I've been trying to think how that happened. I know you knew Patricia Pearson, the journalist, and I had gone to school with Patricia, and so we sort of met up that way. But I think Patricia wrote a book called When She Was Bad, which was about women murderers, for lack of a better term. And I think she was working with you somewhat on that book, or I know she also covered the Paul Bernardo, Carla Homolka trials in Toronto. So maybe you met up that way. However you met up, I on my own started to look at the suspicious death of my sister. Quickly came to figure out that it was probably a murder, and then found out that there were two other cases from that area that were unsolved. And I think what happened is Patricia asked you to kind of look at the information and to validate it. I don't think you and I ever spoke during that time. I was really a guy actually hoping to be proven wrong. I really wanted someone to come along and say, well, Mr. Allure, you don't get it. Or this crime was solved, you just don't know it. Or what you're interpreting as an act of violence is not, because you're not an expert in criminology. And that never happened. And I kind of take it for granted now, but I do remember when we received your, I think it was a couple of paragraph analysis on the probability of these cases being connected. It was a huge shocker for me. And I wondered if you would comment, for as much as you remember those cases, on your involvement and what you saw.
I originally met Patricia Pearson, who I believe was at that time writing for the Globe and Mail, at a conference somewhere in Florida. Steve Egger introduced us, and Steve is famous for being the professor who came up with the term linkage blindness, the difficulty police agencies have, or the refusal police agencies sometimes have, in linking crimes. So we met there, and then when she was writing her book, she mentioned some of my research, some of my ideas, but like you said, it wasn't until I was in Washington, D.C. that she contacted me regarding the case of Theresa Allure, your sister. And she was wondering, so I think she was writing a very large series for the Globe regarding what had happened, and she wanted my thoughts on it. I get such requests every now and then, and I don't have a horse in the race. It doesn't matter to me whether someone's theory is correct or not correct. All I can do is follow what the evidence was, and you can't say anything for certain, but you say what is the most probable explanation for this. And when she showed me the information, I looked at locations. If I remember correctly, the different cases involved both encounter sites, or were the places where the victim was last known to be, and then where their bodies were dumped.
Correct.
And they all kind of intermingled. And this was in an area that did not have a lot of violence, deadly violence against women. There weren't a lot of strange murders. So there certainly were a lot of reasons to consider these to be serial murder cases, and definitely the police should have investigated them as serial murder cases. Unfortunately, they had dismissed your sister's death, and as a consequence, didn't collect key physical evidence that would have been incredibly valuable. There was no effort to kind of connect or even consider the possibility that these deaths were linked. It was a very frustrating case because of lost opportunity.
Correct. And something I'd like you to also comment on. In the case of the youngest victim, Manon Dubé, who was tall, although somewhat, was 10, although somewhat tall for her age, the conventional wisdom from law enforcement at that time, right up until today, has always been the Dubé case cannot be considered because it was obviously a hit and run, and number two, it could not have been a sex crime because she was found with her clothing on. What's wrong with that thinking?
you have to be very careful when you see things like obviously, because why is it obvious? What is your evidence for thinking it's obvious? The key thing here, I think, when you talk about that as being hit and run, is what is missing is the run part. A hit and run means hitting someone with a car and then you run away. You don't put the person in your car and bring all the physical evidence of their body and their clothing into your vehicle and then transport them to some other location. That just doesn't make any sense at all. As for whether or not the clothing indicates sexual assault, well, it was wintertime. There's a lot of dynamics in terms of what could have happened, and anyone with any experience with a range of cases know that things are not always what they seem to be when you deal with sex crimes, because the sex part is in the mind of the offender, and that's not often straightforward, normal sex that you and I might know about. So that is very problematic thinking, and it's also problematic to say, oh, well, let's just treat this not as a crime and not investigate it as a crime. It's what you should do is you investigate something suspicious as a crime. If the evidence supports something else, then that's fine. But that's not what happened here.
Right. And then you and I have never discussed this, but over the years I want to be careful how I say this. I have included a number of other Quebec unsolved cases from about 75 to 81 and been very careful not to say they are all connected, but to say they should be considered because there still are unsolved, and there are similarities. But the problem with that is that they don't appear in that cluster of Sherbrooke area. They sort of bleed over into a midway point halfway between Montreal and Sherbrooke, and then there's a cluster in Montreal. And in order to be fair, I mean, you've cautioned me in the past about chasing suspects. You mentioned linkage blindness, and I think there's also a danger of over-linkage. Would you like to comment on that at all?
Well, there's a number of ways that it's possible to link crimes together. The most powerful is, of course, physical evidence. You have, DNA recovered from one crime scene and matches that of another, or fingerprints. So that establishes a linkage with, a degree of very high certainty. Then you've got witnesses. So, maybe a rape victim described the offender a certain way, and that matches how another victim described it. But there's, under the stress of an attack and the possibilities that lighting conditions are poor, that not all witnesses and victims may be sober. There's a lot of error associated with that. I remember one rape series in Manhattan where one victim described the offender as black, another described him as Hispanic, another described him as Italian or Mediterranean, the other described him as Middle Eastern. The end was all the same person, established with certainty through DNA. And if you have a murder case, you may not have you don't have a victim that you can talk to, and you may not have any witnesses. So that doesn't become possible. Now, if you're dealing with a bank robbery and you've got photographs, maybe from surveillance cameras, you can be a lot more certain. So that kind of falls in between. The final category is behavioral linkage of crimes. So is there similarity in the behavior that allows you to link them together? And the two most powerful predictors are time and space. In other words, how close the crimes are together geographically and how close they are in time. So those are the most powerful. Then you've got modus operandi and signature in other aspects that may suggest, victimology that may suggest the crimes can be linked. But we're now dealing with probabilities, not certainties. And when you look at a large enough area and a large enough time span, you are going to have more and more crimes that could be linked. But you start drifting from very probable to not so probable to possible to highly unlikely. And so it's difficult to know where to cut that off. And the problem with too many. We talked about the problem of failure to link crimes because then connections are not made and evidence isn't correlated, and it really is a problem for the investigation. But you'll get the reverse if you have too many things being linked, because you're now introducing information and evidence that is unconnected, that they're not related, and that will just confuse the investigation, if not send it down a completely wrong path.
Right. However, given what you've said, I will note this. Space and time, 100 miles, 5 years, and similar victimologies, modus operandis, and signatures. I'm just saying.
I don't find that, in terms of the research, I don't find that compelling. If we're talking 2 miles in 60 days, then I do.
Okay. And related to that, so I think it was around 2008 you edited and co-wrote the book Criminal Investigative Failures, which is sort of a textbook to law enforcement. Why did you feel compelled to champion that project?
Well, John, ever since the missing women case, which was an investigative failure, even after victims identified as a prime suspect, he was still allowed to murder 13 more women, at least confirmed by DNA, could be higher. So the question intrigued me is, why did we miss this? Now, there has been some research and a lot of publicity surrounding the Innocence Project that looked at wrongful convictions, and related to aspects such as errors made by eyewitnesses or false confessions or forensic failures. I was more interested, though, in faulty thinking by detectives. So I just began to read. I began to read the psychological literature. People wrote about military failures and fiascos, and political mistakes on the world stage, medical errors made by doctors, engineering disasters, and eventually put all this together in the form of a presentation that I gave to some Crown Counsel at a meeting in Alberta in Banff. And then that led to writing it up as an article. I think I did a number of articles for police journals, for example, Police Chief, the publication of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the FBI Law Enforcement Bulletin, the RCMP Gazette, and then finally tried to pull everything together into a book. But in addition to the more academic aspects of the book, I wanted to include some case studies of things that I thought would be useful learning examples. And one of the most dramatic, of course, was the case of Theresa, and then that's when you and I began talking again about pulling it all together into a book chapter.
Right, which was actually a highly rewarding experience for me to do, and I thank you for that. I want to kind of touch on a few final things here. You appear at the end on the bonus material for the film Zodiac, and I wondered, did you work on the Zodiac case? And it's obviously not at the time, but were you asked to, or did you volunteer to work on that case to help and solve that?
I was asked by the production company for Paramount during the time that they were with David Fincher's movie Zodiac that starred Jake Gyllenhaal came out. They were doing sort of an extended DVD, and they asked if I'd be interested in doing a geographic profile. They also talked to a colleague of mine who had been with the Department of Justice in California to do a behavioral profile. So we had some rules. First of all, they were able to gain access to some of the original detectives, some of the original evidence, the reports. So that's always key. If you don't have the information, you can't do the profile. They flew us out to California, or flew me out to California. We went and visited all the sites and interviewed us. but we made it very clear that the results that we were going to produce were going to be consistent with our analysis and not with anything about the movie, and they were very good at that. And I think we were both happy with the work and our findings. Of course, they weren't at all supportive of the theory that they came up with in the movie or the books the movie was based on. But it was a fascinating.
Right. I was going to ask you, who do you think did it? But I know you're never going to answer that question.
I can tell you the geographic profile pointed to a certain location, but there could be hundreds of possible people there. This is always one of the issues. If you do something like this years later, there's no active investigation to follow up on some of these points. But it's intriguing to think of the possibility that if you were involved at the time, you might have been able to, play a role in help focus the investigation. And of course, we know so much more now about how to respond to serial murder cases than, was known back in the 60s.
Another matter. The Canadian serial killer Clifford Olson at one time said that he was responsible for my sister's death. And I can't remember if he said that directly through channels that you knew or how that came about, but you learned of the knowledge first, and then you passed that knowledge on to me. Why would an offender do this? Obviously, Clifford Olson had absolutely nothing to do with Theresa's death.
Well, Clifford Olson also tried to pretend that he knew, that he might have done or knew who did the Green River killings down in the Seattle area, and of course that was nonsense. I think Clifford Olson's just a classic psychopath. He wanted attention. He was very good at manipulating the media to gain that attention. You have to say he was, for someone who was not well educated, he certainly knew how to accomplish some of his objectives. But he has no conscience, or had no conscience. He just played around with people and got what he wanted, and didn't matter if there was any consequences. Right.
Switching back now to geographic profiling, I want to talk about some of its other lesser-known applications outside of criminology, but actually things that I really find very, very fascinating. I think I've heard it can be used from anything from graffiti removal programs to animal control. You worked in the Middle East in using geographic profiling, detecting IEDs to be able to find out perhaps where the terrorist was. Recently, I heard you use geographic programming to determine a probability of who the graffiti artist Banksy is. Do you want to comment on any or all of that?
Well, after I came to Texas State University, two separate streams developed. One is because of the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq, U.S. military and some Canadian military were interested in tools to deal with the problem of IEDs that provide improvised explosive devices, which are responsible for the most deaths and damage in the theaters there. Some of these people had been police officers and were on reserves, and so they had some familiarity with geographic profiling. So, there's some of that I can't talk about, but basically we ended up getting funding from the U.S. Army Topographic Engineering Center, from the United States Marine Corps, from some of the intelligence agencies, to do research on applications of geographic profiling to counterinsurgency and to counterterrorism. And as part of that, we did training, and we trained people from the military in the U.S., Canada, the Netherlands, Australia, etc. So that was one interesting angle. Entirely separately, I began to get some requests from zoologists and biologists about potentially applying geographic profiling to look at animal foraging patterns. And we took a look at the foraging patterns of great white sharks off of the coast of South Africa, or bee hunting patterns, bee movement patterns in a lab in London. And there was bat foraging in Scotland. We just did something recently on the spread of invasive algae in the Mediterranean. And the idea here is that there are a lot of similarities in some of the questions and some of the behaviors of animals and plants, that this particular approach can be useful. And probably the most useful is in the field of epidemiology. So you have an outbreak of malaria cases in Cairo, and you're trying to figure out where the mosquitogenic breeding pools are, which may be nothing more than just a puddle of water somewhere.
Yes.
That resulted from a break in a water main. So that's one very interesting analysis, or set of analyses. And then you mentioned graffiti, almost for fun, with colleagues from Queen Mary University in London, England. The analysis was done on the known locations of Banksy's graffiti. And we didn't have a list of suspects here, but we did have the suspect, Robin Gunningham, which apparently is the only viable suspect anyone has ever generated. So at least we could compare these results and see, do they support Gunningham, or do they suggest Gunningham, is not a good match? And they did support him. Now, it doesn't tell us that Gunningham is Banksy, but it does tell us that he's a better suspect geographically, than we did before the analysis. So that was quite interesting.
That's fantastic. I love those stories. They actually just make the whole area of research really, really enriching.
Well, it's also fun too. And if you're going to work, you might as well have fun.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I noticed. I think you serve on sort of an oversight board for Austin. Is it the city of Austin? Recently, they were having a problem with a backlog of DNA in rape kits, which is not uncommon. We have the same problem here in North Carolina with the State Bureau of Investigation, who's involved. Well, they're the main ones who need to clear, the rape kits, and I think there's a 2-year wait. Can you talk about that? Working, being, obviously a chair at Texas University, but also working within the community, the municipality?
Well, one of the things about being a university professor is you can get caught up in academia and lose touch with reality. And as a retired police officer, that wasn't something that I ever wanted to do. So as a consequence, I still work and provide operational support for police agencies and criminal investigations. I get involved in legal matters involving possible wrongful convictions or alleged wrongful convictions. And I've been a member of the Austin Public Safety Commission since it was formed in 2009, where we provide policy and budget advice to City Council on matters relating to the police department, the fire department, and EMS. This particular one, issue that you mentioned, is one that I feel strongly about because it relates to criminal investigations, and we want to make sure that all the tools are being properly funded and appropriately applied so that offenders can be identified and prosecuted. And we've had this issue with not only with the backlog, but with the actual closure of the Austin lab. And it's going to take a while to sort out, but I think it's important to keep it, kind of front and center there. And we can play a small role in that on the commission.
Well, it seems fundamental. I mean, if you have DNA evidence, just sitting on a shelf waiting to be analyzed, and there's the dangers that these offenders could up and escalate the level of violence, I think you'd want to have that just as soon as possible so that outcome doesn't happen.
Yes, I definitely strongly agree with that.
I want to kind of close this portion. I'm going to end with some quick questions that are fun. But I wanted to ask you one kind of final thing. Given the Picton situation that you were the whistleblower on, and then since then we've had the Highway of Tears in British Columbia, 450 mile stretch of Highway 16 with possible missing and unsolved cases between 20 and 40. We have the Project CARE task force in Edmonton, Alberta, dealing with 83 missing or murdered women. And then we've also had a task force of missing and murdered women in Manitoba, up to 45 potential victims there. In all of these cases, these task forces have been formed. And then with that, they are given access to crime databases such as ViClass and DNA databases such as CODIS. Are you surprised that, given this, more cases aren't being cleared? I mean, there was a couple of weeks ago the article about the researcher Thomas Hargrove. It was called "Serial Killers Should Fear This Algorithm." He's got a mathematical way of analyzing Part 1 crime supplementary data. But one of the observations that came out of that article is the clearance rate seems to hover in both countries, the United States and America, at right around 66%. Why do you think more cases aren't being cleared, given that it should be the case that with greater technology, we should be able to make advances?
Well, I think there's, I just want to clarify a couple things. CODIS is a U.S. system. Canada is a national DNA data bank which does the same function. And the clearance rates for homicides are significantly higher in Canada than they are in the United States. But they're higher yet in the United Kingdom than in Canada. Within the United States, which is a very large country, we see very big discrepancies in the clearance rate. So it's not all about, police departments would sometimes have you think it's just all about the different nature of the crimes, and that's not true. There's some agencies that do a much better job of investigations than others, and often that just comes down to resources, money. How much are you willing to throw at something? You mentioned some specific serial murder cases, and there have been arrests made, I'm probably most familiar with what happened in Alberta, but here are the issues. First of all, these crimes are hard to solve. All stranger crimes are hard to solve. The reason most murders get solved is that there's somebody most likely associated with the victim that's responsible. And when you break that nexus, that becomes really difficult. Even if you have DNA, if the offender's not in a DNA data bank, all you can do is compare it to a suspect, but you have to identify the suspect first. Second of all, if you come at these late, which occurred in the Highway of Tears case, you've got one hand tied behind your back. Offenders sometimes stop what they're doing or go into what we call remission, so they're inactive for a while, and they become a lot harder to apprehend if that's occurred. Some of these population groups, particularly street sex trade workers, it's very difficult to get the basic information about, when were they last seen alive? What were their regular patterns? And in the missing women case in Vancouver, some of these people weren't reported for months. And then, of course, you tried to find out what they were doing when they were last in, and then no one knows. So these are really difficult cases to solve. So can we do better? Yes. Can some agencies do a hell of a lot better? Definitely. And they should be held accountable. But on the other hand, the community has to be willing to pay for improved services. You kind of look at what the investigator ratio is for a murder in the United Kingdom versus the United States, and you can see what part of the problem is, and then that comes down to a money issue. If you don't pay a lot of money, you're not going to have a lot of detectives, and you're going to have delays in your forensics. So at the same time we're screaming about lowering our taxes, we have to recognize that we're going to have fewer services. And then finally, just some crimes will never be solved because the offender didn't make a mistake. There's no evidence. Things just didn't work out, and that is a reality. We're so used to watching television movies that we'll kind of expect things to be swept up in 60 minutes, And in reality, that just doesn't occur. I think we have to applaud the police agencies that have set up functional cold case squads to continue to look at these things, because a number of them have been solved even years later. But we just have to recognize that not everything is going to occur. One final point I want to make is, even though some of these really difficult cases exist, the fact, like, let's take Mr. Pickton again, okay? Well, yes, it was hard to solve that case, but when you solved it, you solved 49, potentially 49 murders. So these people are prolific. Prostitutes could be a problematic victim group, but on the other hand, prostitutes have a 100 times risk rate of murder than the average woman. So they're more vulnerable, and therefore the effort has to be put into those crimes because they attract the most dangerous predators.
Kim, thank you for a completely comprehensive answer to my question. That's why I asked you. I want to close now with something I call here the lightning round, rapid round. It's just a series of questions so that people who listen can maybe kind of get to know you on a more fun level. And I'll just shoot these out. What book are you currently reading?
I'm reading a book on. Well, I always read more than one book, but I'm reading Dispatches, which was about the Vietnam War, and reading a book on forecasting that was written by Nate Silver.
Dispatches is by Michael. Yeah, I know that book. It's great. He also wrote a book on the reporter in the heyday, the gossip columnist, Walter Winchell, and I can't remember the guy's last name, but Dispatches is great. What are two things we might not find on your LinkedIn profile page? If you even have one.
I don't have a LinkedIn profile page.
Why did I know that was the answer? What are two things we might not know about you?
It's hard for me to know what people don't know about me. I'm a compulsive reader. Always have enjoyed reading. I have to have a cup of coffee every day because my brain doesn't work until I have that coffee.
There are more photos of you with a cup of coffee in hand than maybe you care to know.
I'm a late night person. Most of my work is done late in the day or in the evening and early morning hours. I think maybe a function of too many years of shift work. Mm-hmm. I think one of our most I think one of the things we need to consider in this country is what we want our political system to look like, and it's very interesting, but also challenging. Do we really believe in democracy? How should our elections be handled? And some of this stuff is very, very large. And other things, I think, we look at the threats to democracy, and I would point to gerrymandering as one of the most biggest threats. But both parties are guilty. I think that it's as a someone who likes to read and research and think about things. It's fun to work in other areas. I had an article published recently in an astronomy journal, so not too many criminologists get to do something like that. Nice. And that to me is what makes the job creative, interesting, exciting, and hopefully useful.
What was the first concert you ever attended?
Struggled, but I remember that before I moved from Saskatoon, which was after I finished my BA. And
was it the Guess Who?
No, it was sometime in that time period. I could give you either Procol Harum, Bee Gees, and Supertramp.
Oh, those are three good ones, Kim. Nice.
It's not bad for Saskatoon, Saskatchewan.
What was your favorite cartoon as a kid?
As a kid, it was Peanuts, but now it's Doonesbury.
Nice. What's your? I'm going to ask this, and I think you're going to say I don't do this. What's your favorite TV show to binge watch?
Game of Thrones.
Oh, you surprised me. Nice. And finally, what's your favorite lunch spot in the Austin San Marcos area?
I don't like lunch. I don't like.
It's Starbucks, isn't it?
Yeah, I want to go there. I want to more or less be by myself. I want to read a book, have my coffee, wake up, and I don't really want to interact with people till later in the day.
Sounds good. Listen, Kim, we've filled up an entire hour. It's been just fantastic for me to talk to you. You have always been a great mentor to me, and I appreciate you taking the time.
It was fun.
Okay. You take care.
Thanks for the opportunity, John. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye. And that is our podcast for this time. I hope you enjoyed the interview with Kim Rossmo. If there's anything that was discussed that has an interesting visual component, I will post it up on the website, www.theresalore.com. As well, if you'd like to contact me, there is a Gmail address. It's theresalore@gmail.com. That's theresalore@gmail.com. I welcome comments, tips, suggestions for future episodes, etc. I'm also on Twitter @JusticeGuy. That's @JUSTUSGUY. And I welcome reviews, positive reviews. Boost up the profile of the podcast, which is always helpful. And certainly if you're trying to close unsolved cases. And you can, I think, provide those at any of the platforms, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or iTunes. So that's all for this time. Take care and have yourselves a great evening.